Today on The Population Factor, we ask how limiting human numbers can help humanity stay within the safe planetary boundaries for use of the biosphere. Our guest is Karen Higgs, author of Collision Course: Endless Growth on a Finite Planet. The Planetary Boundaries Framework is an interesting new way to think about creating sustainable societies. Planetary boundaries and human limits. Today on The Population Factor, we discuss how these might be related. Our guest is Karen Higgs. She's the author of Collision Course: Endless Growth on a Finite Planet. Karen, welcome to The Population Factor.
Thank you, Phil. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. So you have written quite a bit about sustainability, about growth issues, about the ideologies connected with economics. You've really written on a wide variety of things. But today on our show, we brought you on to talk specifically about the planetary boundaries approach and how human numbers fit into that whole question. So could we start, for a start, could you explain the Planetary Boundaries Framework?
Okay, yes. So there is a team of scientists led by Will Steffen, who's an Australian climate scientist, and Johan Rockström, who's a Swede, I believe. They have been working on figuring out what are the physical limits of the Earth system. What can't we afford to breach? And the things that they're most worried about are the phosphorus and nitrogen contamination flux that has gone. It's mostly due to our agricultural methods. So they see that, and the species loss, the natural attrition, as being the two things that we're already in very dangerous territory.
So what you're saying is one of these planetary boundaries is the amount of phosphorus that is building up in ecosystems. Another is our ability to retain biodiversity. I think altogether there's 9 planetary boundaries, correct?
Yes.
Climate change is one of them?
Yes, but it's not just phosphorus. Nitrogen is probably even more serious.
Right.
So anyway, yes. So then this is where they were up to in 2015, but I've spoken to Will, and he says climate should also be in there with the top as a situation already in danger. I mean, it's pretty obvious if you were in Northwest Northern America or Southeast Australia in recent times. It's clear that we've reached a level of climate change that is causing just incredible extremes.
So we have a climate change issue. Let's talk about that in terms of boundaries.
Okay.
What does it mean to say we have a planetary boundary around climate change?
Okay, so these scientists have worked a lot looking at what will happen if we go on in the direction that we're going, and we are already at a stage where we have an enormous amount of carbon dioxide, methane, and some other greenhouse gases as well in the atmosphere already. And unfortunately, despite all the good intentions, it keeps climbing. It's still going up. Look, nobody knows where the actual boundary is. Nobody knows where we're actually going to have something cataclysmic happen. But we do know that we are heading in the wrong direction, and we're still going much too fast in the wrong direction.
So they set the planetary boundary for the amount of acceptable carbon in the atmosphere at between 350 and 450 parts per million. And so I take it the idea is somewhere within there, if we keep increasing, and we're about at 415 right now.
Yep.
Somewhere in there, we could pass a point where the changes to the climate will become threatening to human well-being. That's the boundary idea.
That's the boundary idea but it's not just human well-being, I think, as far as these people are concerned. They are looking at what point will the Earth system break down. So it's the whole shebang, if you like. It's us and our entire natural environment.
So to stay on the issue of climate for a moment, we could also be stressing that system so much that we could start in process irreversible declines or feedback mechanisms so that no matter what we do, things could keep getting worse. So again, the idea is we don't know exactly where that boundary is, but there's a sort of a safe operating space, and if we're smart, we don't necessarily want to go beyond that.
Yes. The thing is, Stefan and Rockstrom and co., they believe that we're already past the safe operating space as far as nitrogen phosphorus flux goes and as far as species loss goes. And I think they're on the verge of saying as far as climate goes. And the fourth big one is a land system, which is clearing the forests, draining the wetlands, all that stuff. And it's very important to remember that, as you said, there are tipping points. So there will be people are worried about the frozen methane in the Arctic Ocean and off the Siberian coast. And it's also pretty clear that that the Greenland ice sheet and parts of West Antarctica are melting at an ever increasing rate, and that this means, well, this is really bad luck Sydney, bad luck New York.
So, okay, we've got these planetary boundaries: climate change, stratospheric ozone, land clearance, biodiversity, nitrogen phosphorus systems. We want to stay within that. Now my question is, how does population relate to the planetary boundaries?
Okay, so as far as the boundaries go, there are some areas where the population is a pressure on them. And one of them is the land system, their land clearing and species. But then there are others where really it's clearly our affluent, rich world that is threatening. So if you're looking at climate, we are the major emitters. And even though China, they always say that China, well, the opponents of this view say that China is now emitting more than anybody else, but it's also got a lot more people than anybody else.
Sure.
And you can't speak of human numbers in isolation. I would say that affluence is as large or larger, because if you have a situation where we have massive globalized trade, and there's a lot of research being done to show that it is our numbers, which are not the ones that are growing out of control, except in Australia, that our numbers are the real problem, because it is every one of us is, I don't know, I read somewhere 68 people in Bangladesh use about the same amount as an Australian.
So you're saying numbers in the developed world, even if they're not growing, they can still be more of an issue than numbers in the developing world?
Well, yeah, look, they can be at least as much of an issue or more. I mean, it's also very clear that in certain parts of the world where people have lived just off the local land, I know there are parts of Africa and certainly parts of Latin America where numbers are part of the problem. But in a way, if these countries with the massive population growth were not trying to provide all this stuff for us, things would be a great deal better. There's one lot of researchers have shown that that about 40% of all species loss is due to what we use, like it's our palm oil, our timber, our stuff.
But whether we're talking about the developed world or the developing world, there are many more people living in all these countries than there were 100 years ago. So in a sense, I think you might be setting up a false dichotomy there. It's per capita consumption or its population. I mean, really looking at most societies, we have a lot more people, and we're consuming at a higher per capita level.
Yep. Look, it's not. I'm not suggesting it's either or, Phil. I'm not
Okay.
saying it's one thing or the other at all. What I am saying is, I am not keen to talk about population in isolation from the affluence, the consumption factor,
Right.
because it is very clear that we must have some kind of redistribution, but we can't have 8 billion, nearly 8 billion people all wanting to live the way you do in America or we do in Australia. We can't have that. It will not work. The boundaries are already breached in some cases. So we can't have the whole world chasing to become like America or Australia. Must not be, because it won't, it is, well, finite planet.
This planetary boundaries approach has become very popular among researchers, and it's even being used now somewhat to formulate policy and talk about policy choices. One thing we haven't mentioned yet about the connection between planetary boundaries and human numbers is reducing human numbers seems like a good way to take action to help with all the planetary boundaries. In other words, if you have fewer people, everything else being equal, you're going to have less greenhouse gas emissions. But you're also going to need to convert less habitat to feed people. And that's always seemed to me a particularly important point that often gets lost in these discussions.
Look, yes, I certainly agree with that. I agree that too many people is already the case. And I am very, very much in favour of women and girls being educated, having free access to education and free access to family planning measures. I noticed that even the UN doesn't include this in its sustainable development goals. There's nothing about family planning, which seems to me to be quite wrong, a huge gap in what should be being done. But I think we shouldn't ever lose track of the fact that it is too many people and too much stuff.
Right.
So it's the people using the stuff, it's not the people who live there or there or there, so much as us and the amount of stuff we use. So I think the affluence has got to go too. Even if you can reduce the population, we have to change. We have to free ourselves. I have no idea how, Phil, but we have to free ourselves from the consumer economy, where production is based not on basic human need, what we all need. We all need material security. That's a given. But the stuff, the production, it's a whole system of production and consumption.
So I'm a little worried, Karen, that you tell me you don't see how we can get past this, because I know that you've spent a lot of time sort of studying the ideology behind pro-growth economics. You've in your book, Collision Course, you talk quite a bit about how advertising has been put to use to sort of gin up extra consumption, and you tell a very interesting story about that. So when an expert like you tells me, well, I don't know how we can get off that train, now I'm really starting to get worried.
I'm not here to worry you, but I'm one of Greta Thunberg's gang, people who say we are in an emergency, it is now, and every time people say, oh, we'll do this or we'll do that, or, we'll cut our greenhouse gases, we'll stop clearing the forest, and then you look at the figures 5 years later and it's worse. So that's that's the tragedy of it. Is I'm very happy if somebody can show me things getting better. I don't want to be a pessimist, but I also don't think if you're heading for the iceberg, you don't say, oh, she'll be right, mate. You you can't do that.
So,
or you'll crash.
One place where I get some hope is talking to my students at Colorado State University. I teach freshmen every year and teach classes in environmental policy. And I've noticed within the last 5 years especially, a really growing willingness to question growth, whether that's population growth, economic growth. I think the rising generation has a sense that we're going to have to start doing things a little differently. And, the good news is if we really get serious about confronting growth and looking for alternatives, I think we have a lot of things that we can bring to the table. We have great technological knowledge. We have a sense that we're pushing up to and past planetary boundaries, so we have that incentive to act. And now with younger people showing a real willingness to question some of the economic verities, maybe that'll all come together.
Well, I hope so too, Phil. I mean, I would not like to be part of a generation that had really consigned the future to oblivion. I really don't want to be part of that. But I think that if we're waiting, look, I don't have kids, but I have young nieces and nephews who are in their 20s who are also very conscious, very aware. But if we're going to wait for them to grow up and take the helm in 40 years or something, it's too late. It's got to happen now. It's now. The emergency is now. So this is my main concern is we have to change now.
Where do things stand these days in Australia in terms of population growth? I know for a while now there has been a lot of support for a so-called Big Australia, an attempt to continue to increase and grow the Australian population. Has there been any kind of a backlash or a movement away from that approach, or is the idea still let's keep growing?
There may be amongst the younger generation that you were talking about, maybe they understand and they will oppose it. But really, we have what we call the Liberal National Party, which is equivalent to your Republicans, or well, they're all the same anyway, and our Labor Party more equivalent to your Democrats. But they are, as far as these things are concerned, they really, it's driven by the growth ethic and the business classes again. They want to sell more houses, more white goods, more newspapers, everything, computers. They want to sell more of everything. So I don't know, even the Greens can't really be trusted to be very strong, particularly on population. Now, the problem, because, I'm very happy that population is a big part of the problem, especially in Australia. But as our Murray-Darling Basin area sort of goes into drought every 10 years now and supposedly feeding us but won't feed anybody in the end.
So I'm struck by something you said a moment ago. So the Green Party is certainly stronger in Australia than it is in the United States. They're concerned primarily with environmental issues. What's the Green Party Australia's take on population growth?
I think the problem with population is that there was a great movement against it. And there's a little box in my book where I talk about the Coalition of the Unwilling. And there was a big move against it. It was by the evangelicals in America, the Saudi Arabians, the Vatican. There was this big move, and also by the market, the neoliberal ideologues, the people who thought, let the markets, they'll solve it. The market can solve everything. And so in that context, around the Reagan time, an attempt to address this was completely squashed by the propaganda that you can't control it anyway. Let people do what they do, and the market will solve it. And that seems to have persisted as the ruling view of most people.
But if you talk to Green Party members, they would agree with a lot of what you said. They would agree that the market can't solve everything. They would agree that neoliberal economics isn't the approach they want to take. And yet that doesn't seem to have translated into a concern to address population issues. That to me is really fascinating.
Okay. Well, see, and another thing though about the population issue is that there was a period back in the, 60s, 70s when there was evidence of, there was the one-child policy in China where people were really very, very badly treated if they had more than one. And generally, there was an ideological reaction to controlling anything about individual rights.
So is part of the issue that people really don't see how we could address population, maybe advocate for smaller families, They don't see how we could combine that without being very authoritarian and controlling. So if you were trying to convince a person like that, what would you say?
Well, I would probably try and talk about how the planet is a much smaller thing than what has always been assumed. And if you want your kids to have a decent life, then don't have too many. In fact, I think one or two is far better.
Well, speaking as the father of two children, I think two is plenty. There have been times when I've felt it was too much, but certainly two is plenty to keep me busy.
Yes, two is especially in the US and Australia, in the rich world. You know, two is because every one of those is going to be taking up the planetary space of, you know, 50 or more people who are scraping their life, you know, just struggling to stay alive. There's still a lot of people don't even get enough to eat. So, you know, anyway, I think we're on the same page here, as they say in America.
Well, Karen, are there any points or any issues you'd like to bring up that we haven't covered today?
There were a few of the boundaries that we didn't talk about, but one of them is the pollution and novel substances, the things like the plastics in the Mariana Trench and stuff like that. So it is, and this is to do with too many people too. I mean, that's another one of the boundaries that they haven't figured out. The team haven't just figured out where that boundary might be, but they know there is one somewhere. But so my overall attitude, though, Phil, is we have to address both population and consumption. We need a new system of production and consumption, as well as trying to get family planning measures across the world available, free, easy, and without forcing anybody, without any force.
Very good.
Things.
Agreed. Karen, this has been a wonderful discussion. I appreciate you rising a bit early and coming to us from, I think you're coming to us from Beechwood, Australia. Is that correct?
That's right. New South Wales, a bit 200 miles north of Sydney.
Well, thank you so much for making the time for us today, and thank you for being on The Population Factor.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Phil. It's been great.